Welcome to the Tuesday evening lecture series here at the West Virginia Archives and History Library. You probably noticed when you walked in there was some the figures with heads cut out and things like that. Today we had the History Bowl for the 8th graders. It was the final session of the History Bowl. We had a lot of 8th graders walking around, and man, it was quite a bit of questions and things. A lot of the staff was involved in it. It was really neat. But, we do have some upcoming lectures I'd like to mention on coming up soon, and I don't have the date here. The J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks, and that is next Thursday, not this coming Thursday, but the Thursday after this, will be J.Q. Dickinson Saltworks with Carter and Nancy Bruins. Also, Nancy's brother will be here, Lewis Payne. He'll be here to talk and have a little bit of input on that lecture. On May 21st is our first of the 2015 block speaker series, African American Life in Charleston with Lewis R. Smoot Jr. June 2nd, History of the West Virginia Supreme Court with Rory Perry. He's the clerk of the Supreme Court. And June 18th, West Virginia Songs with John Lilly, who just retired from Golden Seal. He'll be coming here that evening and having some music for us. And then on June 25th, another of the block speaker series, African American Life in Charleston with Ronald W. Newsom. Tonight, Dr. Melissa Sartore will discuss Outlaws in West Virginia, War, Whiskey, and Wonder, and not a Robin Hood in sight. West Virginia is associated with outlaws and outlaw activity in the minds of many, in aspects of popular culture and even in history books. Outlaws similarly evoke notions of Robin Hood figures that fight injustice and give back to society despite breaking the law in doing so. There are very few indications, however, that any outlaws in West Virginia, John Brown and the Hatfields and McCoys, for example, were heroic. West Virginia's relationship with outlaw behavior, such as fighting, bank robbing, and moonshining, reveals the complex relationship between law, culture, and justice in Appalachia, while demonstrating how the definitions of outlaws shape and are shaped by our collective consciousness. Dr. Sartore will discuss outlaws in history and folklore, as well as how West Virginia has fostered the outlaws it needs, Robin Hood or not. Dr. Sartore received a BA and MA from Western Illinois University and her Ph.D. in medieval history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her dissertation, Outlawry, Governance, and Law in Medieval England, was recently transitioned into a book published in 2013. Dr. Sartore currently is an assistant professor of history at WVU-Tech. Please welcome Dr. Melissa Sartore.
Evening. I was going to read that, but he read it for me. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to start off by looking at definitions. What is an outlaw? Is an outlaw a criminal, a hero, a bandit, an outsider? West Virginia is associated with outlaws and outlawry, but very little evidence is found of what we would identify as outlaw heroes, a Robin Hood, anywhere in West Virginia's history. Often, what we call outlaws are actually social bandits, not mutually exclusive terms, but they do have some differences. Sociologists and historians identify outlaw heroes and social bandits as often peasants under some sort of oppressive lord or state. They're often considered to be a criminal, but remain within their own societies as heroes, avengers, champions of justice. Bandits are not just criminals. They act against an injustice. Their struggle is legitimate, and they're resisting against individuals with wealth and power. These struggles often involve land, resources, ethnicity, religion, political borders. The heroic aspect is often part of the later myth by some larger group. Social banditry is a global and historical phenomenon, universal, and capitalism is an essential factor. Outlaws are outside the protection of the law, outside of society, but social bandits often remain in the fold. There are three kinds of bandits that can be identified: primitive, resistance fighter, or guerrilla unit bandits, terror-bringing avenger bandits, and noble robbers, or Robin Hoods. Violence is an inevitable part of all of these forms. Informers are common, betrayal is common, a brave death, charisma, boldness, or some sort of underdog status becomes part of the outlaw hero. Outlaw heroes often have a role in telling their own stories. For example, Jesse James wrote many letters. Outlaw heroes also have an afterlife that include rumors of life, song, ballads, or even supernatural abilities. The line between historical truth and historical myth is often blurry, at best. In addition to the identification of the three types of bandits, we also have what is called the Robin Hood principle, or the outlaw hero principle. And this is really an elaboration on one type of social bandit. The core part of being a Robin Hood outlaw or an outlaw hero is that there is some sort of aspect of taking from the rich and giving to the poor. Outlaw heroes are a real and mythical symbol of what is deemed right within a society in which they operate. The elements in the outlaw hero tradition operate together over time and over space. The first part that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to just briefly describe what each one of these parts is tradition. Fictional and historical people in many national and ethnic groups are part of the outlaw tradition, outlaw hero tradition. Figures are celebrated in folklore, they're romanticized by media, they're related to powerful notions of national, ethnic, and regional identity. They form a fundamental cultural paradigm. They're not always factual in terms of later tellings. Versions are often presented only after communal approval has been reached. Circumstances related to an outlaw hero are often those in which they are oppressed or believe themselves to have been oppressed and are treated unjustly by one or more individual. Time, space, situation, these are all conditioned by social, political, and economic forces. Actions and articulation of those actions are consistent with tradition. And then we have the incident. There is usually one incident in which the outlaw hero will be ignited into a series of events that produce his hero status. Conflict and tension usually involve some sort of inequity, and incidents are usually magnified in folklore. The individual in question is usually charismatic. He's handsome. He's a sweet talker. He's sentimental. He's precocious. The myth usually takes this over quite quickly. There's usually some display of wit or style. The narrative framework continues to grow, and we have the establishment of some sort of moral code. A moral code for an outlaw hero is a set of informal guidelines of approved or unapproved actions. Outlaw heroes are aware of what is considered the right way to behave, although they may not always behave accordingly, but they always become or remain heroes in their own minds. Acting honorably is an important message for gaining support and sympathy. The cultural script of the outlaw hero is where history and myth create the heroes themselves, as well as their associates and their actions. The role of the heroes, the victims, the villains, and the supporters are all culturally predetermined. And then we have an afterlife. Outlaw heroes, in accord with their moral code, have some sort of myth-making that creates a fantastic afterlife. Patterns of life and death accord with the lives and lives and legends of those who came before them and persist in those who come after him. Folk tradition often interacts with media and art. The outlaw hero cycle, as you can see, continues to feed into itself. And the parts, they're not always in the same order, but they do all blend together. The life of an outlaw hero is based on resisting, but also on having sympathy, getting support, living and dying within circumstances that are deemed oppressive or unjust. Connection between certain individual figures and a strong sense of identity among their resistant communities are essential. The type of identity identified with a bandit can be regional, provincial, national. It can be based on ethnicity or some combination. So what kind of bandits does West Virginia have? We need to understand the historical and cultural context of West Virginia to even attempt to answer that question. West Virginia is tangentially connected with outlaws and outlaw activities, and this is in large part due to geography. West Virginia is an area that was created as a frontier. Mountains, rivers, unsettled in many areas. And violence is often associated with frontier. Frontiers are often lawless and violent, but this is not true for everyone. Robbery of all kinds were less common than we may think. Law enforcement was not a big factor. Often lawmen were just as bad as the bad men. Towns were usually composed of young, healthy, adventurous males, but people in towns often lived by discipline and order. The violence and lawlessness associated with frontiers is often overstated. Nevertheless, outlaw heroes existed on both sides of frontiers. Contested borders and frontiers are often a very big part of the outlaw tradition, and we'll see that today. West Virginia is in the unique position of also being associated with both the North and the South, if we're using larger regional terms. The South, again, often associated with violence. There are theories of social violence associated with the South, and a long tradition of Southerner stereotypes, duels, fights, lynch mobs, church burners. This identification of the South with violence plays into the identity of West Virginia. Southern self-consciousness was created by the need to protect a particular institution from threats originating from the outside world. That could be part of the formation of West Virginia, or any other part of the South defending itself against civil rights activists, atheists, Wall Street, whatever a perceived threat may be. Being Southern, then, inevitably involves a feeling of persecution at times. This is, again, perhaps overstated, but cultural references and mass societal perceptions of a Southern subculture certainly play in to what is going on with West Virginia outlaws. So again, where does West Virginia fall? Well, we're going to start off by talking about some of the specific individuals that can be found associated with West Virginia history, people and events alike. Outlaw heroes, terrorists, will come down on which category they may fall into as we move forward. First one I want to talk about is Michael Cressup. As part of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, King George, following Great Britain's acquisition of the French territory in North America, forbade all settlement past a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. Michael Cressup, during this same time period, near Wheeling, not yet part of West Virginia, admittedly, was involved in contests for the Ohio Valley lands in this region. Cressup responded to calls and was commissioned to defend the area around modern-day Pittsburgh. He began scalping Indians on the Ohio River Valley continued to go further west, and in 1774 participated in what is known as Cresap's War, a series of skirmishes with the Shawnee. He murdered several Indians along the way, and the media caught word of his actions. He began to receive semi-celebrity status, but there were various views on his behavior. He was a barbarian. He was a so-called frontier bandit, and it represented the still divided backcountry from eastern cities on the eve of the American Revolution. Cresap's skills all of a sudden became necessary and useful during the Revolutionary War, however. He was first portrayed as a frontiersman, but he later came to embody independence. Cresap was soon a patriot. He was even presented as having qualities of a good Indian as opposed to a bad Indian. Cresap became the model of American citizenship, and while he was too old and ill to fight in the Revolutionary War, he was later mourned as a man and a symbol of the American Revolution. In 1774, there was very little difference between settlers on the frontier and Indians, but as the war approached, those backcountrymen were needed by Easterners. They had come to terms with frontier bandits, and Cresap's transformation was part of that national identity. In the same time period, we also see Louis Wetzel. Louis Wetzel, along with some of his fellow operatives, I'll call them, were captured in the upper Ohio Valley in the late 18th century. He was held captive in 1778, and he escaped, but then vowed publicly at Wheeling that he would hunt Indians as a vocation. He killed several Indians throughout the 1780s, and his contemporaries were appalled by his behavior. Others still protected him. Wetzel is physically described wearing Indian dress and as athletic, tall, skilled, with a rifle. And his guerrilla-style tactics were certainly not unique in the time period or in the area. So we see that war is certainly part of this identification of an outlaw. And that's going to remain true as we move forward. John Brown. Now, is John Brown an outlaw? We'll talk about that a little bit. John Brown, devout, religiously motivated, he wanted to fight slavery. In the 1850s, Brown went to Missouri and Kansas and took part in the tensions and violence in the Free State, Slave State skirmishes. In 1857, by 1857, he was speaking regularly about the anti-slavery movement. He set his sights on Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry was a strategic location, a defensive stronghold due to its location, rivers, mountains. It was inland, but it had proximity to Washington, D.C. It was difficult to know exactly when Brown decided this would be his target, but he continued to work toward setting himself up at Harper's Ferry in 1859. He was looking for land. He planned to march on Harper's Ferry, seize bridges and railroads, the armory, the arsenal, and the plantations outside of town. He caught the town off guard in October of 1859. He took hostages at the armory, sent messages out. He wanted to arm slaves with weapons from the armory. Townspeople were not convinced that Brown was there to be peaceful, and they were not as sympathetic as Brown had hoped. By the afternoon of October 17th, panic and anarchy had set in because their position, Brown's position, was increasingly unstable. Soon the situation proved to be bleak, and the hostages were not cooperating. But Brown would not surrender. He said he had already been proclaimed an outlaw. He had a reward on his head, and he knew the consequences of his actions. Generals were sent in to end the standoff. Some of Brown's men were murdered. Brown himself was injured, but was taken, interrogated, and set to stand trial. There's a huge amount of misinformation associated with what his intentions were, false alarms about slave uprisings, and a huge amount of theatrics associated with his trial. But prior to his hanging, he was allowed to give a speech. In his own words, he said that he had designed to save slaves, to move them like had been done on a larger scale prior to his activities. He never did intend murder or treason or the destruction of property or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion. He even went on to say, had I interfered in the manner which I admit had been fairly proved, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, then I would be worthy this punishment. So he himself is not identifying with this idea of a noble hero. John Brown was later lauded and canonized. His military attack had failed, but his movement had certainly made an impact. There were sparks of later insurrection, fears of insurrection, and the debate over Harper's Ferry continues. The idea of the Civil War also brings us such Appalachian outlaw heroes as Champ Ferguson. Again, not necessarily directly related to West Virginia, but he is part of this larger cultural phenomenon. Champ Ferguson was a guerrilla fighter. He had a guerrilla mentality. Brutality during the war, as well as against some of his own personal enemies during his life. There were media accounts of his death as early as 1864 that he had just been seriously wounded. Interestingly enough, he was taken into custody by Confederate authorities, later put on trial for killing 53 men. He was found guilty of being a guerrilla, not a soldier, and sentenced to death for 21 counts of murder. Unlike some of the other outlaw heroes or social bandit heroes that we've met, his success was not advertised in the same way, and no real indication was given for his motives. The Civil War also brings us the James boys. There seems to be a desire in West Virginia, as well as in Kentucky and in other parts of Appalachia, to identify with the James gang. Cole Younger, Frank James, they robbed the bank in Huntington in 1875, or at least it said that they were. It was thought that they were 2 of 4 men involved in a bank robbery at Huntington. And this is because there were similarities to some of the other bank robberies committed by the James gang. Historians are split on whether or not they were actually involved. But Kentucky lawman Delos Bly was determined to catch the gang. Bly was convinced that there were associates of guerrilla raiders from the Civil War settled in Kentucky, and they were closely associated with the Younger brothers. After the robbery, Bly sent pictures to Huntington to see if the robbers had been the Younger brothers. The bank president looked at the pictures and said, yeah, it looks like them. So from that time on, regional newspapers began to cover the bank robbery as though the Younger brothers and Jesse James had committed it. And again, the crime did resemble activities of their outlaw behavior. They would enter a town, they would pose as cattle buyers, they would rob the bank on a Monday, mount their horses, leave town slowly, and then gallop off, waving their hats once they were out of range. So a chase took on after the robbers after they left town. The fugitives, however, were able to escape and cross into Kentucky, where a new posse was launched to capture them. The bandits split up into 2 pairs, and at several points during September, there were gun exchanges, but the bandits were chased into the mountains. The 4 men were reunited again where one of the men was then shot. The man that was shot was treated by local doctors, and Bly was contacted immediately. Bly disguised himself to try to get a confession out of the outlaw, but the outlaw refused to identify himself. Bly asked about the outlaw's companions, and he said that he was with Bud. Now, Bud was a common nickname of Cole Younger, and Bly was convinced that the evidence of an old chest wound on the man's body was the same as that of Jesse James. A bank cashier identified one of the robbers, but the man died without ever having revealed his name. However, news spread that Jesse James had been captured and then died. However, this is where we get into a little bit of a media back and forth. According to the press in Missouri, it was not Jesse James, but it was Thompson McDaniel, another Missouri bandit. McDaniel was a horse thief. He had shot an ex-Confederate soldier and fled. And so there was a media back and forth as to whether or not James had been involved. The Louisville detectives attempt to discredit the death of McDaniels, Jesse James' latest effort, a poor opinion of Bly and Pinkerton. The media back and forth continued. Even so-called outlaws in the area were convinced, however, that the man who died was Jesse James. Several men stopped by the house where Jesse James had died, and there was a so-called outlaw wake. One of the compatriots came to see his friend or his associate around that same time, and he was captured. This was supposedly Cole Younger. He was later identified as Thomas Webb and taken back to West Virginia, convicted of robbery, and sentenced to 14 years in the state penitentiary at Moundsville. And he confessed on his way to prison. He said that the act had been the James brothers. He said that he refused to give the names of the James brothers, and he identified other men instead. Jack Keene, Jack Rogers. Lots of other names were given, and now there were attempts made to connect the associates of the James boys with the bank robbers. Stories started flying about McDaniels, the dead outlaw. McDaniels had fled Missouri and gone to Texas and hid with the Youngers for a time. McDaniels had a brother who had once robbed a bank with Jesse James. The McDaniels family was connected to the James, so West Virginia was as well. There was never an identification of the two bandits who were never caught, so historical tradition has them as Frank James and Cole Younger. It even went so far that in September of 1875, Jesse James himself, supposedly, wrote a letter denying involvement and denouncing Bly. Sources from Missouri and Kansas alike continued to disallow this idea that the James boys had been involved in a robbery in West Virginia. We still don't know. And then we have perhaps the best known outlaws associated with West Virginia. Are they really outlaws? Are they unique? The Hatfields from Logan, now Mingo County in West Virginia. The McCoys from across the river in Pike County, Kentucky. Raids between the two families began as early as 1863, and the first death associated with the feud was as early as 1865. The family leaders, Devil Anns Hatfield and Randolph McCoy, they're well-known figures. And in 1878, Randall McCoy accused one of the Hatfields of stealing a pig, and this resulted in a trial. Floyd was acquitted, the Hatfield was acquitted, when McCoy's nephew testified in his favor. The increased tension between the two families continued as they interacted and even intermarried. In 1882, 3 McCoys stabbed Ellison Hatfield, and the 3 were later tied to trees and shot. There were continued attempts to have Hatfields arrested for various offenses by the McCoys. Requests were made for extradition from West Virginia by the Kentucky governor. It was denied, and now even the two states were at odds. In 1888, some of Randall McCoy's family was killed by the Hatfields. The Hatfields were then hunted, and there was the pitched so-called Battle of Grapevine Creek. 4 Hatfields and others were hanged in 1890, and the feud ended. But perhaps there's a bigger reason for the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. The feud only served to dramatize primitive and violent aspects of mountaineer culture, but the feud, however, included aspects of economic modernization. The modernization in southern Appalachia in the late 19th century caused the worst excesses of the feud violence. It was a struggle over the control of resources, and key links between the feuds and economic modernization can be found. The Tug Valley region had previously been isolated. At the height of the McCoy and Hatfield feud, contact opened up. A river path opened, communication and cooperation escalated. Social cohesion around the region continued to grow. And even religious tensions continued to rise. In the 19th century, the increased population and imposition of game and fishing laws threatened traditional hunting economies. Surrounded by the growing industrialization, the McCoys and the Hatfields became increasingly competitive. The McCoys cut timber, and they sued over the using other people's lands. The Hatfields formed a company to cut and haul timber, but he actually won a lawsuit that got him more land. Timber set neighbor against neighbor. The events of the feud, were about property and power as much as anything else. The Battle of Grapevine Creek in 1888, the symbolic defeat of the Hatfields, the Hatfield Outlaws by the McCoys, even that proved to be something of a respectable, temperate middle class defeating those who resided in the mountains. Feud was about men struggling with the same historical forces of capitalist transformation that had been taking place in America since the American Revolution. Changes in Appalachia are also found when it comes to moonshining and liquor taxation. There's a mythological aspect of moonshining in Appalachia. The history of moonshining in Appalachia can be traced back to Scottish and North Irish whiskey making its trip over the Atlantic, and it was part of the individual freedoms and autonomies of the first settlers. West Virginia had corn, abundant corn. They used soft creek water. Industrious farmers came together to make moonshine, sometimes also called Mountain Dew or White Lightning. Once an excise tax was imposed, the black market income developed. Gentlemen criminals were born. In 1791, soon after the colonies became a nation, Congress imposed the first taxes on stills and whiskey. 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion rose up in western Pennsylvania and parts of present West Virginia. Scores of people considered respectable and law-abiding by their community were suddenly deemed criminals. The early 18th century migration to North America as a result of trade laws and land costs, people had been seeking to escape that. Now they were right back in it. Settlers began to move west increasingly, and they found themselves interacting with Indians more. The Civil War and whiskey tax, combined activities of 1862, once again saw Appalachian mountaineers fighting for a state that would proceed to outlaw one of their most important survival strategies. By the time the Volstead Act and Prohibition reached the United States in the 1920s, Many southern states had already outlawed liquor, including West Virginia. Prohibition took effect in 1914. Throughout the 1920s and until 1933, the United States government enforced nationwide prohibition, causing a dramatic increase in moonshining. Even when the national prohibition ended, parts of the South remained dry. Some imbibers remained partial to Clear Mountain whiskey, so moonshining did not disappear. But by the time the 1950s and 60s rolled around, moonshining had taken on a new role. Production, trade, and transport of moonshining remained communally based, and there was surplus labor and corn available. Moonshining constituted an economic foundation and cultural currency that was predicated on a shared understanding of a need for secrecy, but also a pride in a community's own resourcefulness. Moonshine did decline in the 1970s, but was still an important resource. The threat of prison, well, that was just considered to be an occupational hazard. Moonshining was illegal, but not considered to be criminal by law enforcement agents. Moonshine was a social demarcation defining insider and outsider status. It could be either a positive or a negative, depending on the frame of reference or depending on the stigma. The desire to distance oneself from history as socially and morally suspect behavior simultaneously began to exist with pride in a culture built on marginalization. Owning part of this history is part of the cultural identity and has even become part of the tourist industry. Tourism, as the next step of moonshining, became increasingly profitable. And we start to see our legends or ideas of outlaws blend. The cultural significance is what keeps the activity alive, in contrast to earlier economic necessity. But that cultural significance is itself an economic necessity. The legacy of moonshining is anti-modern, stereotypical as offensive, but also evokes a sense of separateness that is not disagreeable to all. Moonshining also carries legacy of conflict on top of isolation. The stereotypical Appalachia constructed through a myriad of relationships with people, places, and institutions that implicitly and explicitly challenge one another's authority and legitimacy. Relational history of moonshining functions as a critical lens with which to view the roots of Appalachia's marginalization and contradictions contained within its cultural reproduction. So I once again ask, where does that leave us? A quick search of the internet reveals that outlaws are still alive and well in West Virginia and in some of the most unusual places. The mission statement of the West Virginia Outlaw baseball team. The Outlaws are made up of top talent in southern West Virginia and southwest Virginia. The mission is simple. We want to form a roster of the top players in our area. Our goal is not to win games, but to get kids signed to play college ball. There was once a basketball team in South Charleston with the same name. And even in terms of a documentary, a 2009 documentary, we see the wild and wonderful whites of West Virginia. Not the most favorable depiction of outlaws in West Virginia, but they were worshipped by some and hated by others, and the legend of the White family started growing after the release of this cult documentary. The dancing outlaw put a spotlight on the family, and the family self-identified as outlaws. The family and all three of the generations shown in the documentary quickly found their audience. Additionally, outlaw trails in West Virginia, the lore, the industry, that has all become part of West Virginia's identity. So we're back to the outlaw Robin Hood principle. Where does it apply? wherever and whenever significant numbers of people believe that they are victims of inequality, injustice, and oppression, historical and/or mythical outlaw heroes will appear and will continue to be celebrated after their deaths. The principle appears to be valid across time and up to current day. Social bandits may work for the restoration of a traditional order, a real or mythical past. It can be a revolution of sorts and can grow into a large movement. The bandit or the outlaw becomes a hero, becomes a symbol. Bandits in literature and popular culture give us freedom, heroism, and the dream of justice. And while violence and criminal activity certainly did and does exist in West Virginia, bandits within the subculture often take the form or role of a contrarian to oppressive justice. Social bandits and outlaws, as we perceive them, are part of a common good, but with a rife tension. Competition and struggles over land, resources, including at times, legislation and political interests, are manifested with the activities, perception, and continued use of social bandits. The Robin Hoods of the world cannot be separated from the struggles that produce and perpetuate them. West Virginia has and does use the image of social bandits, mountaineers, to define itself. So regardless of the real outlaw heroes West Virginia has the heroes it needs. Thank you. I don't know, do we have a question?
Last week, I gave a tour up in Spring Hill Cemetery, and there was a group of folks that had come from mostly eastern Indiana and western Ohio. And suddenly one of the women in the group asked me, she said, "Why is there a Confederate flag flying in the cemetery?" And then she could see off in the distance. And I said, "Well, because there is an area up there that is dedicated for the soldiers that Confederate soldiers that died in the battles that were fought around the Charleston area, and that there, I guess, is a modern organization that's dedicated to maintaining the identities and the integrity of those soldiers." And there was just a brief discussion, but I got the impression that they thought that it was a bit much, for the flag to actually be flying.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't sure where to take the conversation, because I just thought, well, it's a part of history. It can't be denied.
Right.
And the opposite end of the spectrum would be to just let all of that information evaporate, and nobody knows that they're there, or who they were, or what they did. So I think, in West Virginia, there's we have kind of a mixed bag of sentiment about that.
Sure, and I think that it's the ignorance in terms of the young, or the people who don't understand the significance of the flag that fly it, that cause that sort of reaction from somebody on the outside. Because there is a real history to the Confederate flag, and it deserves its it's due in that context, but a lot of people just don't see the historical context. But I think it's part of the duality of West Virginia. West Virginia has so many different things pulling its identity. It's a fascinating place. And when I started to research this, because I'm not from West Virginia and I'm an outsider coming in, I thought, oh, I'll find all kinds of outlaws. I'll find everything. Outlaws are just part of West Virginia. It's really much more difficult to find the tangible elements of it. So you have to find why that is, which is sort of some of the theory that was driving how these things come together. If you don't mind, talk up here, the guy who showed me the room, he's like, yeah, my family's full of outlaws. And I just wanted to be like, tell me more, but it just sort of stopped there. But it's interesting that people identify that way. It's fascinating to me.
Well, excuse me, but one other person in the group said, but I thought that West Virginia sided with the North in the war, and I said, well, they did, but in the secession of West Virginia from Virginia, I said it wasn't unanimous. I mean, it was certainly, there were a lot of contention among the people in the area of West Virginia about whether they wanted to secede or not, and which side of the war they preferred to fight on.
And that also presupposes that the Civil War was only about slavery, and
right.
It's certainly not the case. Yes? Sure, you want to? Yeah.
I'm a magistrate in Boone County for 10 years, so I'm pretty familiar with the wild, wonderful whites. Jesco has only been in magistrate court one time in 10 years, and that was for a domestic battery. And they ended up marrying the lady, and they're now in Tennessee. The outlaw of the crowd is Mamie White. Two deputies were sitting in the Danville Tudor store having breakfast. Mamie pulled through in her station wagon, ordered her biscuits, gravy, and paid for this with hydrocodone pills. So she was immediately arrested. Her case is pending in circuit court. True stories.
It's fantastic. Yes?
What I find so interesting in West Virginia is there are so many cases where both sides are kind of viewed as outlaws, depending on the vantage point of the person making the judgment. You have in mine wars, you have both not just the mine owners, the corporations versus the miners, but you also have the Pinkerton detectives, the Baldwin Felts, who were seen by heroes as some, yet seen by outlaws as others, that they unnecessarily killed and harassed people.
I'm not making this up. I have a bullet point for mine wars here, and I just didn't have time to do all the research on it. So I completely agree.
There was a comment to make, actually, pointed out some of the pictures of the Hatfield McCoy moonshine. This, of course, Del Wance was involved in moonshine. It's so intertwined with the alcohol and the religion and things. This little story is, and who it dealt with, actually. But the moonshine, of course, Del Wance was with moonshining throughout his life. And well, when his sons died in 1911, he got religion and was baptized, and from all accounts, lived a very faithful religious life after that. Well, in 1924, his son Tennis was involved in a case against Vicey, Del Wance's wife, against Don Chapin, which Don Chapin, of course, had been sheriff of Logan County at that time. But the interesting part about that case was Tennis relates that his co-owner in the bar that they were, the alcohol problem that they were having there in Logan County, his father, Del Wance, was the guy that was co-owner for the bar there in Barnabas. That was in 1921 when, well, Devil Lance died in 1921, but the case was in 1924. So it's interesting that Devil Lance was still in, even with the religious part of it and things, he was still into the moonshine part. That was funny with the Hatfield McCoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago, I'm a retired locomotive engineer, it wasn't that long ago up Cabin Creek, these good old boys, they'd have a chain across the road, they were charging the toll. And they wanted, he's a railroader, let him go. And people up Cabin Creek, they would ride in the mouth of the hog without license plates. And it wasn't that long ago that happened. And my wife and I, we delivered lost airline luggage for 6 months. It's not really lost. You've already bought your airline ticket. They throw your luggage off to throw mail on. That's additional revenue. But you've got some criminals in West Virginia. No, that's true. And it's not lost. And you've got people in West Virginia that are fugitives and do not want to be found. Because we had a heck of a time finding some of these homes. I went through a junkyard. I thought, this can't be right. Went top to hit, no signs anywhere. Going through brush. Went to the top of this hill, and there's a golf course. And there's $8 million homes. I've got a friend who works for the phone company. He said, Rick, I had to go back and get a four-wheel drive truck to put this telephone in. I expected to find a shack. When I went up this creek bed, I've gone up creek bed, he said there was $1 million home. And also what you're talking about, we've gone delivering luggage up these hollows, and people come out with a shotgun. Yeah, for real.
Mm-hmm. Very protective of their space and identity and isolation, yes.
You should try working for the Census Bureau. So. Because I had that happen in New Jersey. But half an hour from New York City, same circumstances.
One of the things I've noticed about, as you went through the various outlaws, sort of a common theme where there was, one, they had to get caught, so maybe West Virginia outlaws are just too good, you can't catch them, but also there had to be some media had to hook onto the story.
Yes.
And of course with Devil Ants, that's exactly what's happening.
Yes.
So I would suspect that part of the reason that they aren't as popular, they aren't as famous, is because that media wasn't there to hook on the story, and again, that they didn't get caught.
Right. The media is a huge part of the development of the outlaw legend, and you see it with somebody like Jesse James, who is writing letters and then maybe not writing all of the letters that are attributed to him. So he's engaging with the media. He's really one of the first ones to engage and actively use the media. Prior to him, there was some rudimentary writing about their activities. But slowly, throughout the development of the outlaw legend, particularly in the United States, although it is certainly a global phenomenon, you see that there is more interaction, and you see this relationship with the media really pick up, to the point where now we have information outlaws who are associated with the internet, and we have the internet almost deciding who is and isn't an outlaw for us at times, in much the same way that you could perhaps see that with the newspaper or television, depending on which time period you're looking at. So the media was definitely involved in the creation, or lack thereof, of an outlaw.
These multinational corporations, they want us dumb, uneducated, on drugs. West Virginians have tried to participate in commerce. Hatfield tried to get railroad service for his timber industry in Norfolk and Western. That's where the image of dumb hillbillies evolved. And if you don't have 100 cars a day, railroad doesn't want to mess with you. And We used to service, one guy got coal out of the river with nets, 2 cars. And multinational, they want to take everything they want and they just throw crumbs at us.
Any other questions?
We tried to start trails to trails up Paint Creek. And we got a grant, $300,000. We had to turn it back in. CSX was going to sell us the right of way for $300,000. We got that grant. The property owner's lawyer went back 200 years and found a clause if the tracks were ever taken up, that the land would revert back to the property owner, and that land was given by the government to Chesapeake and Ohio Railway to open up the coal fields.
Yes.
Just one more quick thing about moonshining. The staff of the archives has read hundreds, thousands of pages of historic newspapers, and we quite often see stories about moonshiners caught, or a lot of times in certain counties it seems like law enforcement was always just a little bit too late. You know, they would get there and the stills would be dismantled and everybody gone or whatever. And you know, it just leads you to wonder. There was a little benign neglect there, maybe. It's hard to say. Either that or maybe the moonshiners were a little more wily than they were given credit for. But a lot of the stories that got more attention in the local media were the humorous ones. And there would be tales about, you know, somebody that was great-grandma getting arrested for sitting on the front porch and hiding a jug of moonshine under her skirt, or, you know, under the cushion of her chair. And one of the ones we got the biggest kick out of was the revenuers and other law enforcement were hot on the trail of some big moonshiners and got there too late, but there was plenty of evidence of what had been there, because the mash had been tipped over and dumped in the pond, and there were 2 paragraphs of description of the drunk frogs. So it seemed like that the locals had more of a sense of humor about it, and that yes, they were doing something criminal, but they weren't truly seen as criminals.
Right. I think, yeah, and I think I mentioned that the difference between illegal and criminal. Just because it's illegal doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be criminal action that requires some sort of response.
I have one more. You open. Are most of the really famous outlaws professional criminals versus, that's the way they make their living, versus just the average person who commits?
Yeah, but I think that has to do with the amount of criminal acts they commit, the number of criminal acts they commit. Somebody like the James boys, they robbed, I mean, we had this conversation where if they robbed all of the banks, they said they would have been much wealthier, but they did rob more than other people. So because they did do more and they had more activity, they got more attention. So not necessarily because they earned their living, but because they were more active in terms of their criminal activity. Somebody who just went to go rob a bank for an isolated incident wouldn't have received the same type of attention. At least not over a long period of time.
Professionals steal from inside the bank.
This is true. Like,
is there any type of, I mean, does it seem to follow a pattern of where it's more of the outlaw going against establishment rather than just sticking up for what is right? Because, I mean, like we're talking in West Virginia, there's so many people that, like you said, that it's harder to find, that are they just sticking up for their individual aspects of what's going on in their surroundings, or is it a fact of where I'm going against the coal company, or I'm going against this? Is those the ones that seem to trigger and bring out more of the spotlight than the guy that attacks the individual rights, the personal rights solely.
I think often they get so meshed up that it's very difficult to identify whether it's one or the other. I'm not sure that they're that easy to distinguish. I think that's part of why a Robin Hood figure is so important or becomes such a phenomenon, because he is initially sticking up for his individual rights. He's initially taking on his own grievance, but then it becomes part of a larger movement. And I think that that's something that you can see, whether it be the railroad company or something along those lines. I think that other people say, yeah, I agree with him, and so I'm going to do that same thing, or I'm going to support him. So I think that they build upon each other. And if you can find a group that is already doing it and then express your own individual rights within that group, that on the other side of that coin, then you can also see how they would interact. Like Occupy Wall Street. Well, yeah, I'm really mad. I'm upset with Wall Street too. I'm going to become part of that movement. And so the movement grew. And what came first, the chicken or the egg? Doesn't really matter, because they spent months sitting outside
Which would
in
really,
a park in New York. So yeah, doesn't really matter.
which would really explain our Civil War confusion.
What do you mean?
Well, either you have groups that were known to have sided with one side or the other, and then you have a much broader perspective of people who just held on to that individual right of do what you want to do, and as long as it's not affecting me.
Well, there's something to be said for that too. Sure. Anything.